Phrases like, can't you just let it go and just let us go back to normal, that kind of stuff. This kind of groupthink and pressure led by the narcissistic family member can often mean that scapegoats in particular are made to look petty and unhinged because they aren't just popping back to normal after being abused and manipulated. And the lack of empathy means that people really don't care about the toll it is taking on the person in the family who is getting the worst of it. How many of you in your narcissistic relationships, whether growing up or in a relationship, felt the pressure to be cheerful? Because if you weren't cheerful, the narcissistic person would be frustrated by you or angry at you. So you felt cheerful pressure. If you had that experience, drop it in the comments and let's break this one down. Let's even take it further. How many of you have heard things like this from narcissistic partners or family systems? Why are you such a sourpuss? Oh, can you smile? I like cheerful faces. Maybe things don't work out for you because you're such a downer. And if you've ever heard other things in the same vein, drop those in the comments. Narcissistic people and narcissistic family systems are often about superficial emotion, as well as about cruelty, mockery, and manipulation. So they'll manipulate and be mean, but then they'll expect everyone to wear matching outfits and smile big for the holiday picture. Sweetie, you seem to be gaining a lot of weight. Could you put on this new shirt? Narcissistic parents view children as their own personal mirrors. They expect the child to feel and behave in a way that works for them as parents, and many narcissistic parents like cheerful children. The general motto tends to be, in many narcissistic families, if it looks good, it is good. So the children are expected to be smiling and happy all the time, and if they're not, well, that can bring up some parental resentment, as well as accusations that the child is spoiled and ungrateful or damaged. So the child may learn to be cheerful and simultaneously also learn to suppress their emotions. Some kids keep it going like this into adulthood. Some kids will then turn to externalizing and may be more likely to have behavioral issues as they get older. They may act out in other ways. The internalizers will just be cheerful but be falling apart inside. Many people in narcissistic relationships will note that their partners would expect them to be cheerful, even after they had endured all kinds of bad behavior. Their needs weren't being met, their partner was of no support or help, and when they weren't cheerful, their partner would invariably gaslight and shame them and say things like, well, maybe I'd be nicer to you if you weren't always so grumpy and such a downer. So the person in the relationship, as most people in narcissistic relationships do, may blame themselves and start believing that they are the problem. They may even start attempting to be that artificially cheerful and sunny person all the time. Kind of has a Stepford wife vibe, like everything's fine, everything's great. Oh, I'm so happy. All of us are so happy. The kids are great. Everything's so great. They tend to speak about a half octave up. We're great. It's great. Narcissistic people like to keep things superficial and light, as a rule. However, it's a little bit more subtle than that. Malignant and our vulnerable/covert narcissistic types, not so much. But the grandiose and communal narcissists, well, they just like want things to be happy, great, life's great, I'm great. And so if you go up to them with your frown or your sadness, which may be reflective of your real emotions or even the actual misery of the relationship, that to them activates this discomfort. So they'll shut it down through blame shifting and shaming. Narcissistic relationships are difficult. Whether this was a childhood relationship, adult relationship, or you've had both, they take a toll on us. They leave us anxious, full of grief, confused, self-blaming. Again, not good for us. Many people will say their narcissistic relationship leaves them with a heaviness. And if we're acutely dealing with these relationships, we are not likely to be smiling all of the time. And even if these relationships are in our past, they do add a little bit of salt to our caramel. We're still delicious, but there's definitely a salty undertone. So it's not unusual for folks who have been through this to sometimes carry this sadness. And when that shows up, it'll get shamed or called out. Why can't you just be happy? In order to survive these relationships, what many people do is that they learn to fake positive emotion. But there's a problematic downstream effect if you do this. We slowly learn to deny our emotions. We may either get really good at playing it happy, and unfortunately that sadness, anxiety, and the other fallout of narcissistic abuse, that stuff will find its way out another way, often through physical symptoms like headaches, stomach aches, sleep issues. Or we attempt to numb those emotions in other ways. That could include drugs, alcohol, or other numbing behaviors. All of this emotional faking can also be dangerous because we may miss depression, anxiety, treatable issues that aren't expressed and may get worse without intervention. But worst of all, we may get pulled away from our authentic selves. We may learn to become actors in our own lives, learning to be the most cheerful of all, giving in to keep things going. We get pulled away from who we really are, what we're really experiencing. In essence, emotionally gaslighting ourselves, and that is never good for us. My favorite, not really, I'm being sarcastic, but is when someone is willing to be vulnerable enough to answer the question, to really answer, how are you doing? And the person who's being asked will honestly say, I'm not doing so good, or I'm kind of going through a rough patch, or it's been tough, only to have the other person say to them, oh, come on now, it can't be that bad. Or other people have it worse than you. There are people out there who don't have a place to live or don't have enough food. It's not an either or. There can be other people suffering, and you can be suffering too. And yes, it can be that bad. The combination of the world's unwillingness to hold space for the pain of others, the push for toxic positivity we see everywhere, be happy all the time, and the demand to be cheerful in narcissistic relationships can take a real toll. This demand to be on, to be cheerful, everything's great. It's a classical flair of grandiose and communal narcissistic families and relationships. And even, frankly, narcissistic, grandiose, or communal narcissistic workplaces. It's not harmless fake smiling. To do this is the denial of ourselves, of our inner states. It's like saying we are not hungry when we are. It's like saying we aren't bleeding when we are. Faking emotion catches up with us and is just one more example of the long-term fallout of narcissistic relationships. As part of healing, it's essential that you find your safe places to share your emotions where they will be respected and seen. And as for the it can't be that bad folks in your life, put them up on the top shelf of enablers who just are not people you should be spending your deep time with. But that pressure to be cheerful, especially in narcissistic families and relationships, and that you're the problem if you're not smiling all the time, and yet your heart is breaking every single day in these relationships, that's a lot to smile through. But unfortunately, a lot of people do learn to do that. And part of healing is allowing yourself to get back in sync with your emotion and giving as much space to the positive emotions as the negative ones. Don't you hate it when narcissists or enablers say, can't we just go back to normal? So what does that even mean, right? I'm sure you've all heard it. I'd love to hear it in the comments. How many times has this happened in a toxic relationship or toxic family? Can't we just go back to normal? To me, it's one of the more loaded and toxic statements that can happen in a narcissistic relationship. Maybe there's a falling out in the relationship, a betrayal, a lie, a major episode of gaslighting, a horrible fight. Whatever it is, it hurts. And for whatever reason, we know what those reasons are, most of us stick these relationships out. Time might heal some of the more prominent wounds. The trauma bonds suck us back in, as does fear. But after these kinds of painful narcissistic events, we're sort of tentative. We may not be as warm or as enthusiastic as usual. We may be more quiet than usual. Maybe we're still a little prickly, whatever it is. Then either the narcissists themselves or others around us will say, well, can't we just go back to normal? Well, the answer to that should be no. We can't go back to normal because this relationship has never been normal. So if you're going back to what it was, well, let's face it, that's not normal. It's toxic and manipulative and inconsistent and uncomfortable. However, that's probably a bigger answer than you can give, because when it's positioned that way, oh, why can't we go back to normal? Once things start returning to baseline, people might think, oh, look, you're getting along again. Things are back to normal. When people say that to you, that can feel a little gaslighty because things were never normal. And just because you're not in the midst of a horrifying betrayal or screaming or tears, that doesn't make it normal. But when people tell you that, hey, it's a normal-ish day, so things must be back to normal, it can be very frustrating and also normalizes toxic and unhealthy patterns. Narcissistic people have an uncanny ability to have a horrible interaction with you, or to say something terrible to you, or to do something terrible to you, and then think that after one night, or maybe a few hours, or even a few days, that everything's good. That just because they gave you a half-assed apology, or came clean on something, or explained themselves, that everything is back to normal. That can also leave you feeling so confused because narcissistic and toxic folks can so quickly go back to baseline, right? Everything's fine while you're still reeling. And there's a reason for that. It's largely because narcissistic people just don't go deep in their relationships. Their relationships are so superficial, pretty much designed for them to get supply, that any disruption in the relationship just feels like a little bump in the road. They may scream and yell about it, but once they kind of get back themselves to where they want, even though it was devastating for you, they're like, everything's normal now. I had my tantrum. Then what happens is that you get pathologized for holding a grudge or for why can't you just go back to normal? But because this roller coaster takes a toll on you, they really don't care. You're clearly having a different relationship experience than them. This phrase of, can't we just go back to normal, is also a tool of the enablers who have no problem with you being the sacrificial lamb, so everyone's lives can just keep rolling as usual. So going back to normal is just code for, can't you just keep the status quo so the rest of us don't need to be uncomfortable? This often happens in narcissistic family systems. Phrases like, can't you just let it go and just let us go back to normal, that kind of stuff. This kind of groupthink and pressure led by the narcissistic family member can often mean that scapegoats in particular are made to look petty and unhinged because they aren't just popping back to normal after being abused and manipulated. And the lack of empathy means that people really don't care about the toll it is taking on the person in the family who is getting the worst of it. Workplaces are vulnerable to this too. There may be a difficult experience or lots of difficult experiences in a workplace, and a toxic boss or a toxic manager or colleague just wanting to sweep it under the rug and say, come on everyone, let's just get back to normal. This may also happen in the wake of pushback on policies in the workplace that call for more accountability, and people, particularly toxic people, may say, don't you just wish we could just go back to normal? I guess when there was no accountability. So in any narcissistic relationships, this idea of let's just go back to normal, it's a ridiculous statement because there never was normal. It never worked right. So, obviously, going back to normal is an impossible destination. It doesn't exist. There is no such place or time. When folks tell you they just want it to go back to normal, what they are really saying is, can you just stop having a reaction to this toxic relationship and just let that narcissistic person just keep doing whatever they want and not push back. And in my book, that is never going to be normal. But if you've heard this, again, drop it in the comments if you have this idea of can't we just go back to normal? You never could. And for narcissistic folks, they want to have their blow-ups and their explosions and their tantrums and then just go through life as though nothing happened. It's also a gaslighting move because you're saying, didn't something really big just happen? And they're just yucking it up and saying, haha, hey, you want some toast for breakfast? And you really do feel like you're in the twilight zone. And that's not normal either. You can't unring a bell. Now, interestingly, the origin of the more regular use of this phrase was actually from courtroom procedures. And the challenge that comes when you ask a jury to ignore something that was raised in the courtroom, but is not supposed to be brought into the consideration of the verdict, right? So someone brought in something, the judge says, no, strike that, but now it's hard because the jury's heard it, right? So it's this acknowledgement that it's hard not to see it or not to have heard it or to unring the bell after something's presented in court. Now, other usages of this phrase include not being able to undo something that has been said or that has already happened. And this idea of not being able to unring a bell is a core principle of making sense of narcissistic relationships. Frankly, it's a useful proverb for understanding the dynamics of these relationships. The reason that these relationships persist are the cognitive dissonance and the justifications that go along with that, as well as the pressure to forgive, to give second chances and things like that. Anything to kind of keep it going, right? If I had $1 for every time I have heard or have shared or have been shared, I should say, stories about the narcissist who has said or done something that's impulsive or impulsively said something or something that's hurtful, and saying like, oh God, all right, so I said it. Can't we just forget that and put it behind us? No, actually we can't. We can't put that behind us. Why? You can't unring a bell. Now, please drop a comment here if a narcissist ever asks you to just, oh, can't you just forget about that thing I said? How did that feel for you? Were you able to unring that bell? Now, when I invoke this proverb in helping people navigate the waters of narcissistic abuse, I use it to remind people that the thing that was said or that was done, it can't be unsaid or undone. I don't care if the person who said it was drunk or high or angry or triggered or frustrated or scared. It was said and it was done and it is not okay. And that event, that thing they said, whatever it is, it becomes a piece of data. Now it's something you know about that person, something you know that that person is capable of. And you file that away, and that means you can have more realistic expectations. Now, knowing this doesn't mean you have to go file for divorce or end a relationship or delete your friend's contact information or stop going to holiday dinners with your family or quit your job. It doesn't mean any of that. What it means is that the narcissistic person can't just magically erase what they did or said, nor should you forget it. If you learn something about them from what they said, to me, this saying brings us back to the world of realistic expectations, that you cannot just conveniently scrub the things that were said or done, but you have to sadly integrate them. Recognize that this person does gaslight, or they do lie, or they cheat, or they do shady stuff, or they manipulate, or they have poor boundaries, whatever the issue or issues are that were brought up by their behavior or their words. That you've basically been allowed to peer behind the door and see a little or even a lot of what is really there. It may mean that you won't and probably shouldn't trust them as readily. You're always told, right? If you have a problem with someone, start from that healthy place of communicating. But if that tanks, which it always is going to tank if you try to communicate with a narcissistic person, then it's time for radical acceptance. And there isn't likely to be much listening or growth in this relationship. Now, in all narcissistic relationships, The cycle of volatility, arguing, ending the relationship, apologies, starting the relationship again, it's all part of the classical landscape of these relationships. So many people going through these cycles will say, well, here we are. We're off to a bright new start together. I wish I could just do that kind of spotless thing to my mind or have my memory erased so we can just start from scratch and forget any of those bad things were said and done. No, you actually don't want to be able to wipe away your memory because narcissism is lots of things. But one of the most consistent things that it is that it's consistent. Narcissism is not a pattern that's amenable to change. And the things that narcissistic people did to you before, they're going to do them again. The lack of empathy and the lack of self-reflection means that they do not learn from their mistakes, and you're not important enough to them to learn from them. And this is why a relationship with a narcissistic person feels like that movie Groundhog Day. Every day you wake up, and it's the same kind of mistakes, right? And it's why these relationships are so heartbreaking, because you can be so vulnerable and trusting and beg and wish and hope that the person would change, and they don't change. And then you are once again believing that they will change because they future faked and they said they would change. And there you are right back at the beginning, and the same thing happens again. And then, as often happens in narcissistic relationships, you wonder if it's you that's the problem, rather than seeing it is the other person. Now, if you can remember just this simple truth that you cannot unring a bell, you can learn from this proverb. Maybe you can learn to be less vulnerable with this person. Maybe you learn that this relationship is just a superficial placeholder, maybe a person to have dinner with from time to time. But it's never going to be a place of depth. Once a narcissistic person cheats on you once, it's likely to happen again. If this is the case, then it's time to ask yourself, are the other parts of this relationship worth it to you? And are you willing to look the other way on, for example, their infidelities, instead of harboring the unlikely hope that they will discontinue their behavior? Only you know the answer to that. Only you know what's right for you. If they gaslight you, you can't unring that. Their gaslighting is a wake-up call to get well acquainted with your reality and foster other sources of support that allow you to hold on to that reality. And please, let's keep the conversation going. Drop a comment here. How did realizing and recognizing that the bell cannot be unrung change the landscape of your relationship with a narcissistic person? Did this recognition change what you expected from the narcissistic person, or how vulnerable you allowed yourself to be in this relationship? Now, there's sort of this obsessive quality for forgiveness, right? We're obsessed with forgiveness, especially in toxic relationships. And this obsession with forgiveness pervades the online relationship website world, the inside of many counselors' offices, pastoral and religious spaces, and feel-good Instagram accounts. This paradigm of forgiveness is often based on ignoring those rung bells. You know my position on this. I am not a supporter of rushed or forced forgiveness. Some people get there to forgiveness, some people don't. Either is fine. Never feel the pressure to forgive on other people's schedule. And even if you never get to forgiveness, I truly believe you absolutely, yes, you can heal from this. Listen, this whole idea of you can't unring a bell is a two-way street. If we screw up, we have to accept that people may edit, alter, or revise their impressions of us. Then, our empathy means that we pay attention to what has happened, and we learn from it, and we do the work. We don't just ask the other person to forget this ever happened when we do something wrong. We learn. We don't do it again. We address it, and we change our behavior, and we sustain that change. Over time, it's not that the bell gets unrung. It's that the new bells that get rung are good bells and compassionate ones, and they are aware and mindful. And our awareness and healthier behaviors are what reshape people's perception of us, not just a snap of the fingers asking them to unring the bell. We earn that regard again. You can't unring a bell. And when we try to cordon off or justify or deny those rung bells, it's a recipe for getting stuck in a toxic relationship and falling into spaces where growth does not happen, and you keep making the same mistakes, falling for the future faking and impeding your own growth and mental health. So let's face it, everyone in toxic relationships is told one thing: set boundaries, right? In fact, everyone in every relationship is told to set boundaries in all of their relationships, family relationships, intimate relationships, workplaces, relationships, friendships, right? Boundaries is a big issue, right? Boundaries means being clear on issues ranging from time to communication to sex, anything, to give ourselves permission to set a line, to feel safe, and to communicate that line, right? I'm guilty of this, right? Is one of even the elements of healing I put out there is giving the guidance that you should attempt to set boundaries in a narcissistic relationship. In some ways, it's a test. And once you see the narcissistic person will ignore or continue to violate the boundaries, please view that as a bit of a wake-up call. I know that the boundaries won't work, but many people want to rule everything out before they think a toxic relationship is absolutely done. So you set the boundaries. You actually may get stronger. You might get stronger through therapy, maybe because you've been educating yourself about narcissism. Maybe you just get stronger from sheer exasperation, but you get stronger, you follow the guidance, and you really finally do it. You set the boundaries. And then, you know what the narcissist does? They call you controlling. I hear this over and over again from people who attempt to set boundaries in their narcissistic relationships. For years, they didn't set boundaries in these relationships because they were confused, or they blamed themselves, or they did not understand what they were dealing with. Some folks did not set them because they just didn't know how to set them. I mean, let's face it, the vast majority of people are not taught how to set boundaries in childhood. And if you had a narcissistic parent, then forget about it. You were never given permission to set boundaries. And if you did, you would have faced rage and punishment. And if you didn't even get to see boundaries being set, maybe even by your other parent or within the family system, when you didn't see them being enacted, it's hard to do something that you were never taught or that you were never given permission to do. But once you set the boundaries anywhere, it may be directly with the narcissistic person, it may be with someone or something else, and your boundary setting is observed by the narcissistic and by a narcissistic person in your life. But when your boundaries are observed, you setting boundaries is observed by a narcissistic person, they will likely tell you that you're being controlling. And obviously that's a bit of a projection. So let's lay this out as a bit of a scenario, right? You are in a narcissistic relationship. Let's say it's with a parent, right? But you can substitute anyone in there. The parent expects you in a very entitled manner to keep doing things for them as soon as they ask you to do them. It is eating into your time and making your life difficult, and you're very busy. You have tried in gentle and appropriate ways to push them off, tried to get siblings to help, or done what they needed in a rush. But more often than not, you do what they need to get done, but you're getting more resentful. Finally, one day, after taking so much time to do the many frivolous things that the narcissistic parent expects you to do, when they expect you to do them, with little awareness of how this is affecting you, you tell the parent, hey, I can't do this every day. I can do these things like once a week, and that's it. Anything else is going to just have to wait till the next week. And please also don't call me during work hours because it's quite disruptive. And then you do that, good boundaries, and the parent accuses you of being controlling, cold, and maybe even manipulative. It can be quite startling to have someone tell you that you are controlling after years of walking on eggshells and then finally making clear what you would think would be clear to any self-aware person. But there's the rub. They aren't self-aware. That's the issue. You, me, all of us, we all exist at their need and at their whim. They are delusional enough to think that we are the problem, that they are always right, and that we have no right to set a boundary. And if we are, then we're being controlling. Narcissistic people pathologize and shame qualities in others, which make their lives more difficult or pick away at their sense of grandiosity and entitlement. If they are the greatest and all powerful, well, then how could somebody actually set boundaries on them? I mean, nobody sets boundaries with the king, right? If you from an early age saw the message that setting boundaries was a bad thing, and then attempted to set boundaries and are then told that you are being controlling, it can discourage you from wanting to set them or from setting them at all. Narcissistic people find that shaming and calling you crazy works, and these comments often will stop you from engaging in the behavior that's inconveniencing them. So it's a really, really clever manipulation, isn't it? Setting boundaries with narcissistic folks will not result in them changing their behavior or honoring the boundaries, but it will perhaps result in you opening your eyes wider to what you're seeing. I know that some people don't set them because they are afraid of the narcissistic person's rage, or they are afraid of losing the narcissistic person from their life. The narcissistic relationship is often about all of us holding back because we are afraid they will disappear if we ask too much or set a boundary. That is your work, because this is an unhealthy space. And for all of us to work on unpacking our trauma bonds to help diminish the power of the narcissistic folks in our lives. As a result, many people in narcissistic relationships, often in order to survive, will find themselves immersed in denial. By not setting boundaries, you don't then have to see how bad the narcissistic relationship is. But once you do set the boundary and witness their reaction, it's a painful and stark reminder of how dysfunctional the relationship is. It can be easier to not set the boundaries at all and remain in denial, because once you set the boundaries and see what it really is about, the grief can be overwhelming. But that, in the long run, is not good for you. So with boundary setting, start small. Start practicing boundary setting with the healthier people in your life who will be willing to respect the boundaries, and then start building up those boundaries in other areas. It can be painful to witness what happens in the relationships when you do set boundaries. But even if you stay, at least you will do so with your eyes wide open and not believing that this is going to change. And no, setting an appropriate boundary is not controlling, no matter what they say to you. Come on, some of us, I've had this happen, certainly. Believe it or not, the narcissistic person apologizes, right? Yeah, it happens. It actually happens more often than you'd think. Now I got to ask you this. What was the apology like? Did it feel sincere? Or was it a pseudo apology like, I'm sorry you feel that way? Or, I didn't intend to hurt you. Oh, really? You didn't intend to? Well, I guess that makes everything okay. And may just mean maybe you're not a sadist because you didn't intend to hurt me, even though you didn't. You did hurt me, right? But all of this, file all of this under toxic apologies. When they hurt you, but their apology is that they didn't intend to hurt you, they can just go F themselves. So the narcissistic person might apologize. By the time they get around to it, it happens on their schedule. And their apologies often don't involve them taking accountability. It can, like I said, be, I'm sorry you feel that way. I didn't intend for you to get mad. Or, I only had sex with that other person because you weren't nice to me, but I'm sorry if it made you mad. You're kind of going, where's the apology in that? Their apology often serves to further pathologize us. But I think that just because they got the word sorry into a sentence, they think that it qualifies as a true apology. But just to hear them form the words I and sorry in the same sentence, for folks that are trauma bonded, that can actually be quite shocking and sadly quite welcomed. The narcissistic apology is often quite late, after they've managed their anger and their shame and their narrative that they are right and you are wrong. And they maintain that belief of they're right and you're wrong, even at the time they apologize to you. Maybe their apology is a hoover, a way to suck you back in. Maybe it's a manipulation to get you to do something they want. Maybe they do it so they look good to the world. Maybe they do it because someone else asks them to or an employer requires it. Like one of those sort of gross politician apologies, and then they turn around and just do the bad things again. But the day comes, whatever their reason, they give you one of these pseudo apologies. And you, I hope, maybe you're getting stronger. And you recognize the BS and the BS of the apology. And I am sorry you feel that way is not working for you as an apology. You don't give a rat's ass about what they intended or didn't intend. You are tired of the toxic carousel. And you say, okay, thanks for this apology thing you're giving me, but I don't think I can accept it. Or I'm not ready to accept it, or I don't forgive you, or I don't care what you intended, or it doesn't feel like an apology, or whatever you feel. But the bottom line is that you do not need to just give them a big hug and tell them how great they are for apologizing, even though everyone around you is going to tell you to do that. And then when you don't take their apology, when they give it, they shame you for not accepting it. And you'll hear everything from you're a bad person, you're unforgiving, you're mean, you're cruel. Maybe they'll even call you narcissistic. They'll tell you you're a bad person for not just accepting their apology. And by that, they really mean that you're not seeing them as the morally wonderful person that they are. They'll tell you that only a dark-hearted person wouldn't accept an apology. And no wonder they're so frustrated in this relationship with you because you're so rigid that you won't take their apology. They tend to conveniently forget that they as a narcissist are a serial offender and there is no apology big enough to cover all of the terrible things they've done to you in this relationship. Even the apologizing has to work on their schedule when they want to do it. And then you have to accept it when they offer it, but only when they wanted to give it, even though you really needed it at the time the bad thing happened. So here's some apologizing 101 for you. Apologies should always be about accountability and responsibility. I'm sorry I hurt you. I'm sorry for what I said. I'm sorry for what I did. An apology is always accountable. And a really good apology also checks in. I'm sorry I hurt you and I'm sorry for what I said. Can I ask, how are you feeling? Ideally, an apology happens in proximity to the incident. The longer you wait, the less sincere it feels. Honestly, a good, accountable apology is never too late, but you got to understand as the apologizer, for the apologizee, some scar tissue has developed and you don't know how they're going to take it. And here's the other half of Apology 101. No one is obligated to accept your apology, not right away, maybe not even ever. In some cases, people will take your apology right away. But in many cases, they may need a minute. And in some cases, people may not accept it. That's their prerogative. If you did wrong by someone, they do get to take a moment to decide whether this apology works for them. But in the narcissistic person's world, everything is on their schedule. And if you do not do what works for them, or that still leaves them holding the shame bag, they do not like it. And if you do not take their half-baked apology and effusively thank them for it, oh gosh, thank you for your apology, well, they don't like that, and they will get mad at you and shame you for it. This is a reminder, though, that you cannot win in these relationships. Like you need another reminder, right? A narcissistic person does bad things, and they rarely apologize in a timely manner. When they do, it's sort of a false apology. And if you don't accept it, then it turns into a new abuse sequence that you're the bad one. But it can also be challenging to be called unforgiving and cold and mean when that is not who you are. When you have been patient and put up with someone's stuff for a long time and are again being shamed because you don't embrace their apology on their schedule, it can bring up feelings of grief, exhaustion, disgust, and anger. And if you are so trauma bonded that their distorted version of reality holds any truth, they're calling you bad for not accepting their half-baked apology may actually, sadly, land for you and leave you feeling worse about yourself. The mantra remains the same in these relationships. You can't win. You really can't win. You know, if you want to drop them in the comments, please share the most awful pseudo apologies you've ever gotten from a narcissistic person. I think it would really be good for all of us to see all of the sort of difficult and nightmarish apology situations we've been left in, where the apology sometimes feels worse than the offense.